And I kind of always reverted back to vulnerability. It was kind of something that always captured a big emphasis of mine throughout sport. So the objective here is to basically, I want to be vulnerable, first of all. I also want to just talk about how throughout sport, sometimes it's difficult to be vulnerable, how being vulnerable can help your well-being, your relationships for sure, but also can help performance. And that was something that I'd never really considered until we had some devastating losses and we had to make some adjustments. So basically, I'm going to kind of structure this out as I'm going to tell you a bunch of stories, some from the beginning of my career where maybe there were certain failures or setbacks where I had to shift my perspective a little bit and able to find and actually to be vulnerable and find different ways of winning, because ultimately it's a cool thing to be an athlete, but there's so much more than just what happens on the court or each point or anything like that. So I'm first gonna, well, actually I should touch on too, as I think in sport, the term vulnerability or other terms like that maybe seem a little bit out there. It's not really the grit you expect from an athlete, but my perspective is if I'm able to be vulnerable, it actually does make me more resilient. It brings out everything out of the shadows and it allows me to see it. And then I have to evaluate where I'm at and it can actually make me a better player. So I'm going to take us back to January 2016, Edmonton, Alberta. I was with the national team. We were going through our first Olympic qualifier. And at this point, I'd never really done an Olympic qualifier. The team in 2012, they did have one. I wasn't a part of that team. So this is my first time ever kind of having a chance at the Olympics. So we played Mexico, we played Puerto Rico, who we've beaten many times, won the games rather handedly. We were quite confident. It was in Canada. We were feeling good. And then the finals was against Cuba. And then that Cuba team, we had beaten them. I don't know the exact stats, but it was something like the last 8 times or something like that. It was a heavy one-sided bout there. We were for sure the favorites. They were a great team, but I mean, on paper, we were better. It was in Canada. Everything was kind of lining up in our favor. And I remember that game, we were getting prepped because the game before us, which was Mexico, Puerto Rico, which was the bronze medal game, started going really long. So I think it was Puerto Rico won the first 2 sets, then Mexico won the 3rd set, Mexico won the 4th set. So we were already ready and basically ready to go on court. And then we were over on these practice courts for about like an hour, maybe even over an hour. And I remember the feeling, the kind of tension on that side court slowly building, slowly becoming almost palpable, right? We're all like, okay, we've been warming up for an hour. Should we keep warming up? Should we stop? Obviously our coaching staff and things like that are trying to help us out, but it's unknown because if the game would have ended in 3, we would have started our warm up right away. But it ended up going 5 and like a really long, epic kind of 5-set match. So we ended up on that practice court for about an hour and a half. And I remember right before we were coming out on the main court, we have to wait there because they're going to do the anthems. They're going to do stuff like that. And everybody on our team was silent, completely silent. Nobody's talking. Nobody wants to admit kind of what's going on. And then what ended up happening, if you know much about Canadian volleyball in the last little bit, was we went out and we get clobbered. It was like 3-0. For me, it felt like the match took 10 minutes. It was like we walked out, we got aced a bunch of times, we made a bunch of mistakes, and the game was over. And I remember we went back in the team room after, and obviously we're all pretty distraught and upset and a little bit heartbroken that we just gave up this opportunity that we thought was ours. It was basically ours to lose. And then that would sort of eventually become the catalyst for our team and this shifting moment where I think there's a few things in there. If we wouldn't have lost as badly as we did, I think we wouldn't have looked as closely as we did at what was going on. If it was one of those like close matches, okay, they just got the bounces, things went well for them. But instead it was like, no, they beat us quite badly. And then we start looking at previous things and it was kind of we had this tendency to almost choke, to put it lightly. Even in the Pan Am games, we got a bronze medal game, but that semifinal game, we should have won. We were the better team and we ended up losing that game. And then eventually it was this sort of team mentality where at the pit of our stomach, we all knew that in big moments, we might choke. So basically we ended up having, after that, we all had to go back to our pro teams because that's kind of how it all works. But we ended up hiring a team psychologist. And then with his work, it was basically like he started unraveling the fact that we haven't looked at the fact that we are nervous. If you are nervous, that's how you're feeling. So that's okay. It was almost like be obnoxious in how you're saying, oh yeah, I'm nervous. Are you nervous? Yeah, I'm nervous. And then he gave us all sorts of other techniques. So I'm going to pause on that story and then take it back to, so we're back in January 2016. And I just want to talk about that year with my professional career. So obviously that was devastating with the national team. But at the beginning of that year, I had signed a contract for Champions League. It was pretty good. It was whatever. But then a few days before I went, there was some legal issues with the club, certain issues with the club, and basically they said they couldn't pay me. So I ended up not going. They still tried to get me to go. I said, like, you know, I'm not going to go. It's like one of those awkward situations. So I didn't have a contract for a good first chunk of that season. I ended up going to Turkey to train with our national team coach before the qualifier, but I really wasn't playing. And then we ended up going to Edmonton for the qualifier. That was obviously quite devastating. And I mean, at this point, just for some context, I mean, I thought I was pretty good, right? I was like young up and coming guy. I'm the starter on the national team. Like, I think I'm great. But yet in the back of my mind, it's like, whoa, I can't even get a good contract. And we just lost to Cuba. Maybe I'm not that good. And then afterwards, so we come back, I went back to London, Ontario after the qualifier. And I remember at that point throughout the qualifier, I was negotiating with another team, actually a better team. So I was excited about it. And I remember I was on the phone with my agent and we're talking and we're basically finalizing kind of things. Then he calls me back a little bit later. I'm on the phone with him and basically it's like, hey, they've actually decided to go another direction and they're not going to hire you. And I remember in that moment, I don't know whether it was a panic attack or what happened, but I remember like hanging up the phone. And then the next thing I knew, I was like on the ground in my living room and I couldn't really comprehend what was happening. You know, my psyche was basically at this battle between, like I said, I think I'm pretty good. You know, people in Canada seem to think I'm pretty good, but yet nothing seems to be working out. And that basically, again, spiraled this, okay, our national team is having this problem and I'm also having this personal problem. Okay, how can I become a better player? How can I become a better person? How can I shift my perspective in these moments? So then now we're leading up into our next Olympic qualifier, which is much tougher. There's a bunch of European teams, a bunch of Asian teams. It wasn't just we had to beat one team and kind of go from there. We had to play a lot of games. And it was in Japan. And I remember at this point, though, we had been working with Kyle, who was our team psychologist, for quite a while. And one technique that I still use, whether it be like in life or in sport or whatever, is he calls it RAR. So there's these three principles, and it's recognize, accept, and reconnect. And it was so simple. It was so obvious. Like, okay, of course you should be in tune with your emotions, with your whatever it happens to be. But these three simple things, and we kept, I mean, same kind of thing. Obviously, you're on a male sports team, so everyone's kind of like making jokes about it, but that evolved it into us trying to comprehend it even more. So we had this, so recognize, accept, reconnect. And basically the function there is, okay, we're before that Cuba game, recognize that we're nervous, right? Like, of course we're nervous. We're going to play for the Olympics. Like I've never done that before. None of the other guys, it had been 24 years since the indoor men's team had gone there. Of course we're going to be nervous and accept that, right? That's a part of accepting it. And then reconnecting to your task. It actually allows you to then, oh, okay, I know what I'm actually doing. I look back at the game plan. I communicate with my teammates, things like that. But where vulnerability comes into that is, you have to be truly honest with yourself, right? You actually have to understand that you are nervous. You have to admit that, which is it's tough sometimes for people. And you have to be vulnerable with your teammates, right? If somebody comes to you and they're nervous or they're concerned about the games and I have my armor up or I'm sort of not allowing that to come in, it's not going to help them, right? And obviously volleyball is a very team-oriented sport. So I want to make sure that I'm able to help my teammates, especially as a setter, right? That's kind of my role. So then we go into this next qualifier, much more difficult. That RIR is kind of our theme. We're kind of going through that. We end up putting a good performance together. We end up qualifying. We won the games we needed to win. We lost a couple of games that it was like, oh, is that going to affect us? Didn't affect us. So we qualified for Rio. And then now we're going into the Olympics. And our first, we were in the pool of death. So it was sold. We were the second last ranked team. We had, Brazil, who was hosting and one in the world. We had USA, who was 2 in the world at the time. We had Italy, who was 3, I believe. So we were definitely, the odds were stacked against us, especially coming in as kind of underdogs. And in our gut, again, we had all this previous trauma of losing in big matches. And I still remember the first game we're going to play the US, and I mean, it was at that moment, all of us are terrified. Like all of us are literally like, we're shaking, we're, hyperventilating, all that stuff. Because in volleyball, we definitely get a lot of crowds. Like if we're playing in Japan, you might get 20,000 people in the arena. It's great. It's super cool, but it's just in the volleyball community, and then all of a sudden the Olympics, it's like, it's just in Canadian community. It's in our culture, right? So everybody's going to flip on the TV and we're going to be on. And I think we all felt that, but it sort of became this rallying point where we were just like, let's really lean into the fact that we're super nervous. Let's lean into that. And it did something pretty cool where it almost shifted from anxiety to excitement. All of a sudden we had so much adrenaline running through our bodies that it became a good thing. It became something that, this is good. I want this feeling. And then we went out and we beat the US 3-0 in our opener. I still actually remember the first point of that game was me serving. And I remember like I could barely hold the ball. I could barely do things. And I tossed my serve and just bottom of the net, like the worst serve I've done in a long time. And I remember all my teammates like turning back at me and the coach looking at me, and I was just like laughing. I was like, I can't even help. This is just where I'm at. And I think we all kind of had that vibe, and you could tell that the American team didn't, right? They were coming from that same like old school mentality of, we're not nervous, we're here to do our job and win. And we could kind of exploit that. So that's my point of always about vulnerability, is to use it as kind of a means to really understand yourself so that you can put your best performance forward. So then, we go to the Olympics. It's great. Then the next summer we go to World League. We got a bronze medal. It was like by far the most success we kind of had as a team. We're kind of cruising. And then we're coming up into 2018 World Championships. And the previous World Championships I was at, we finished 7th, which is like a respectable finish. But I remember going to that one being like, okay, we finished 5th at the Olympics, 3rd at World League. Like, we're going for a medal. This is kind of going to be what it is. And as we're going into that, I think we flew like 3 weeks or maybe a month before we flew out to Poland. We had an exhibition tournament, and we sort of had some things lined up leading up to it. And right when I landed, or basically right when the team landed in Poland, I right away felt like something was off. And at this point I'd played for probably 6 years or something like that, where I was playing 12 months a year. So we play 4 months in the summer with the national team, which is a pretty heavy schedule. Like World League is basically 5, 6, sometimes 7 weeks, and you're just traveling to a new continent each weekend. And then I was playing with my pro teams, and it was becoming a lot for sure. So I kind of chalked it up to, okay, of course, yeah, your bodies can only handle so much. I'm just sore. Okay, we'll rest a little bit. And basically, eventually what happened was we go into that first game in Poland, and I start recognizing, okay, it's a little bit more serious. There's some funny moments where like I thought it was my hip. So I was on the sidelines, and our trainer was trying to pull out from my leg, just pulling my leg. And I remember the coach coming over and being like, what's going on? And I was like, I don't know, something's wrong with my hip. It feels wrong. Then multiple CT scans and all sorts of things afterwards. And we actually figured out that it was a bigger problem than we thought. And then basically, so fast forward a little bit, and now we're at World Championships. And at this point, it's almost when I still was at the phase of my relationship with vulnerability, or I wasn't as honest as maybe I should have been. Because I can still remember one morning so we're about to play Brazil that night. It was one in the world. And I can barely walk. I'm like trying to take certain things, do certain things just so I can make it down to breakfast. Sitting at breakfast is like excruciating as I'm trying to do things. But in my head, I'm still thinking, oh, I'm going to play Brazil tonight. We're going to beat them. We're going on to get this medal. But yet getting up the stairs takes me 45 minutes. I remember I couldn't sleep on the bed because it was too soft. So I tried to sleep on the floor, and then I woke up in the middle of the night and I couldn't move. And I like all these sort of instances where I was like, whoa, whatever. But my brain was still in this moment of, no, like we got Brazil though. It's totally fine. Which again is this like disconnect as an athlete sometimes we have, where we're not actually able to be vulnerable, understanding that yes, I have physical vulnerabilities as well. Like my body can only do so much. So then we end up going so for volleyball, we always have a morning serve receive before the game. So we go to the morning serve receive, and I'm unable to set off of passes just because they're a little bit sporadic. So I can't really move. So our coach is just tossing the ball to me, and he tosses one ball, and all I did is just take one step forward onto my right foot. And I just by doing that, by shifting my weight, by putting in my right foot, something just completely went to my back, and I just fell over and kind of like passed out. And then at that moment, I remember like getting up and rolling over to the sideline and kind of recognizing like, whoa, what's going on? It was another moment where I could feel like the inertia of what I wanted to be the reality, but what the actual reality was. which is the same thing when we were playing against Cuba. I wanted to be the reality to be that I'm not nervous, that we're going to go out and kick butt and play awesome. But the reality is no, we're nervous. Everybody's nervous. It's a big event. And there was this disconnect between that I was suddenly kind of realizing that, whoa, this is still a part of my life. And I still need to recognize that. And then it sort of sent me on this other interesting journey of now all of a sudden I can't really walk. Like I had done that and it was pretty bad. And there was about 4 months where I was really unable to walk. And in that moment, I was constantly battling that same thing, right? Where I identified as an athlete. I think I'm a high performing athlete. I'm an Olympian, yet I can't get up. I can't make my way to the couch. So I was having this almost crisis of sorts, right? Where all of a sudden everything's kind of falling, like imploding on me. And I'm trying to understand what that means and how I can still eventually maybe have good performances, or how this is going to affect my quality of life in the long run, or things like that. And then basically that, from that point on, that injury, it's just been a bunch of trial and error. My back injury is pretty unique, and there's a lot of long-term consequences that could come from it. So it's about, okay, how can I get my strength to a certain degree to get things? How can I get to a certain point? But I mean, being honest with myself, and the sort of concept of vulnerability was something that was always at the back of my mind, because I don't want it to negatively impact my quality of life. I don't want it to be something that all of a sudden I can't pick up my kids, or I can't, go for a run, or I can't whatever. So that was always in the back of my mind. And there was some definitely, like, I tried to play with the national team again. I could only play like 1 or 2 sets. Didn't really work out. Tried to do this, could only do a little bit. Didn't really work out. So then now we're back in 2020, this time in Vancouver, and this time still playing Cuba. So now we're in another shot where it's to play for the Olympics, and we're against Cuba again. And I can't stress enough how different the vibe was from 2016 to 2020. And I think it was a huge thing because the culture on our team has shifted, right? We recognized, okay, of course, yeah, being nervous is a part of it. How do you use that instead of how are you afraid of that? It's almost this relationship with fear that we've kind of understood a little bit better. And then it was my own personal kind of relationship, whether it be with vulnerability or fear or the game of volleyball. I mean, in 2016, it was like, I'm on this skyrocket. I'm going to be the best player in the world. I'm going to take it over. When in 2020, it's like, hey, I just hope I can play. I hope I can go on the court, and I hope it doesn't, I don't step on my right leg again, and that happens. And then it was pretty funny because in that game, it was almost too eerie. It was eerily similar with 2016 Cuba. We lose the first 2 sets really bad and go on to just get even destroyed even more in the third set. And then in Vancouver, we lose the first 2 sets. And I remember my feeling just being, oh, okay, hey, but I get to play. Like, I get to move. I get to actually do these things. I've built stronger relationships with my teammates. I'm now at this situation where we understand that we're nervous. This is a good thing. How do we use that? And then we turned, and the third set was like an absolute blowout. And we basically turned it around and took it back. And of course, I had thoughts in my mind of like, oh, we're down 2-0. We're going to lose 3-0 again against Cuba, and our Olympic dreams away. Of course, that thought went through my mind. Of course, I thought went, oh, maybe my standing float serve isn't good enough, and maybe I'm not good enough anymore to play at this level. All these things were very rational things that were coming onto my mind, but I wasn't resisting them. And I started to notice, okay, if I just accept them, like, yeah, that's a normal, rational thought, then I can recognize that, I can accept it, and I can reconnect to my goal, which is to go out and understand the blocking system and beat this team. And I think that, so all of those kind of stories played along the lines of, maybe I wasn't totally honest with myself, or I was resisting what was truly honest, or I was trying to battle. I was like, yeah, putting up these walls against, because I wanted to be superhuman, right? I've been watching The Last Dance. I wanted to be like Michael Jordan, right? And feel no emotion and just go out and win. But of course, that's not the reality, right? I'm a short volleyball player. I don't think I'm exactly the same as Michael Jordan. But yeah, that's basically my story. I think that was about a reasonable time slot. I tried to gauge it with my clock there. But yeah, I also wanted to just give a thank you to CanFund for giving me the opportunity to kind of speak my mind up here. Also, I mean, as athletes, a lot of times it's not so easy getting funding. I mean, we have the luxury of playing professionally, and a lot of athletes, like especially now I'm out here training at one of the CSI centers, and I get to see a lot of athletes that are there every day. They're there every day training, and it's tough to get funding. I mean, of course, the Canadian government wants to give us as much as we can, but it's not easy. So it's super cool what CanFund is doing, and I'm definitely grateful for everything that they're putting together. And obviously, it also allows us to inspire us a little bit more, right? Like I get to see all these other athletes that it's like, okay, maybe I have a bad back, but look at that other athlete who's in cycling did too. And look, they're competing, right? It's this whole cycle in this community, which I think is pretty cool.
Well, thank you, TJ, so much for sharing your story with us. I know that many people have a hard time trying to learn to be vulnerable, and especially athletes. I find that we're our own worst critic, and we chase perfection, and that sport is all we know. So I think it's pretty cool that you and your teammates were able to kind of rejig what those nerves were doing for you, and use that towards your game. So thank you again for sharing that with us, and we'll open it up to Q&A. It looks like there's a few that have come through. So if you could just read it out before answering.
Sure.
Cool.
Okay, the best result for our indoor team was 4th in the 1984 Olympics. You guys finished 5th in Rio. Your coach was Glenn Hogue, was on that team in 1984. Will he be your coach in Tokyo? Yes, he will. So he was our coach in 2016, and then we had Stefan Antiga, who was our coach who came on after the Olympics. So he was there for 2017 and 2018. But I guess, and actually, you know what? So Glenn mentored Stefan Antiga. Steph had played for him. He was on the French national team. He's a French player. He had played for him in France. He had also, Glenn was an assistant coach for France. And then basically they had a great relationship for a long time. So playing for Steph was very much under the same umbrella as playing for Glenn. They came from very similar philosophies. But the cool aspect was I had only been coached on the national team by Glenn. So to have another set of eyes come in, a younger guy who had a different look on the game. He had just kind of finished, he had just retired as a player, and he was a super crafty left side player. So he brought all these different dimensions to our team that were quite creative, and he kind of allowed us to express that in a certain way. As if you've ever watched the French team, they're super expressive. They do a lot of crazy things, and they're really creative. And so it was really cool to be able to implement that. But I guess he also had some back surgeries and with some grueling stuff that was difficult for him. Canada and him had to kind of part ways, which was super devastating for us because he brought us to that World League bronze medal, which was incredible. But then we got Glenn back, who's kind of our, he's our stable horse, and he's always kind of been around. And so we're really happy to have him back. All right. Another question. How did you create a space where you felt comfortable to be vulnerable on your team? How long did it take for everyone to buy into that? That's actually a really good question. And I think that's probably pretty tough with teams, especially high performing teams, because, first of all, we're competing with each other, right? For starting spots, for positions, for things like that. And then when you're obviously, as you're going and competing, trying to go to the Olympics and things like that, the stress is so high that sometimes, being vulnerable seems scary, right? It seems like a sign of weakness that other people might pry on. So the space that was created from that was from our team psychologist. Right off the bat, when he started doing that, even our first few meetings, people were pretty reserved still. But it was sort of these signs of, okay, once we did that, then we won that, or we qualified for the Olympics. Then we won that opening game versus the US. Then we did certain things. And then, so we basically recognized, okay, this is helping us. Let's kind of lean into that and grow a little bit. It definitely was not an easy thing to create space for that. But I think it's really important if you want to get the most of your team and as an individual to do that. And also I think it comes from, in 2016, I was maybe one of the younger players, when now I'm a little bit one of the older players. So I think it's if your older veteran players embody that mentality and they create a safer space for the younger players, it allows them to be more comfortable. When I first joined the team in 2013, I wasn't going to be the guy coming in being like, hey, these are all my issues. This is whatever, right? It's a culture that needs to be built. Do you want me to just do all of them? Because I saw one really good one from somebody. Okay.
You might have to scroll up more come through, but yes, if you could answer all.
Okay, perfect. Hi, from Edmonton, Alberta. As an aspiring sports psychologist, I'm very curious about what mental skills and training you have used now during the pandemic, as well before the pandemic. I think the pandemic has caused everything to be chaos. So one of the huge things that I've tried to do and that we've tried to do is create some consistency by whether it be having a routine or having talks that are constant or something that you can constantly rely on. And we're actually just starting that up. So we had a couple talks together over the past few weeks, but now we're starting like a week-to-week basis where we're getting into small groups and discussing anything. I mean, we're going to be just discussing like, hey, how has the pandemic affected your life? What's your contract look like next year? Are you happy about where your contract is? Are you nervous about the fact that you're going to go back to a game and you haven't played it for a long time? certain things like that. And then obviously the day-to-day stuff. I mean, I meditate all the time. Practicing gratitude is another super cool way. It seems like, you know, I feel like a small kid who's like journaling or something, but it's crazy the effect of just writing down positive things from your day, or writing down even random things. It's like, oh, hey, that dinner ended up being better than I thought. That can eventually shift your perspective in a bigger way. That is super cool. So those are some things. This is my favorite question so far. Have you considered to play beach volleyball after Tokyo? Looking for a partner. As he's spinning the ball in his hand. I actually have considered beach volleyball, because a huge thing that is difficult on my back is the fact that landing on like a hard surface creates a lot of tension, a lot of inflammation there. And obviously as a setter, I'm doing that 200 times a game, and that causes a lot of problems. So, hey, I'll take you up on that post Tokyo. Let's do it. What is one thing you wish people knew about you or your sport? One thing I think for Canadians that I wish they knew is that volleyball is a massive sport in the rest of the world. Every continent has massive leagues. I mean, in Asia, there's, like, I remember we played in Japan so many times and you can't hear yourself because everybody's going nuts. There's 20,000 people. And then you go somewhere else, you're in Italy, all of a sudden you're at a pro game where it's the two best teams in the world are playing and you can't hear. And then you go down to Brazil and it's like the Olympics, right? It's just nuts. And I think that in Canada, we know it as a university sport, or sport that we learned in phys ed class or something like that. So it's been pretty cool to be able to go play professionally in some of those leagues. And then also to travel with the national team and see how crazy the sport really is. Why can't the team get any media love from Sportsnet or TSN? What does the team feel it would take to get serious media coverage? Actually, a cool thing that happened at the last Olympics, when we were going in to play the US, obviously everybody was like pumped that we were there, even in the Canada House and things like that. Everybody was happy for us and all that. But I don't think we were taking that seriously. Not in a negative way. It's just like you have your notable athletes, your notable teams, and they were kind of getting the emphasis. And I remember when we went out and we beat the US 3-0. First of all, I've never really done that many interviews in my life after that game. That was like obnoxious. Second of all of a sudden everybody started recognizing. I remember the next game was versus Brazil, and like the entire Canada House was at that game. Like a bunch of the people came out, a bunch of whatever. So I do think, unfortunately, but I do think success is a part of that. I think the more success we can have, the more limelight it will get, especially in big events like the Olympics. Like I said, we got a World League bronze medal, but I don't think that really upped the coverage very much. But the fact that we, went and actually performed at the Olympics at a pretty high level, it showed people, and a lot of like kids and people that who were maybe not that interested in volleyball, it showed them at the highest level. And I can relate that to when the first time that I saw international volleyball was in 2007. So I would have been in grade 9 or 10 or something like that. And I remember seeing it and just being literally blown away. I was like, I did not know that this was a game. I'd played it in phys ed class. I had, I'd seen some university games, but when I went out, I was the floor sweat wiper guy. And I remember I was right in the court, and I couldn't even believe it. There was this crazy game that I didn't know. It was different than I'd ever seen volleyball played before. And I actually always like quote this thing, is because on the ride home, I was with my parents and I was like, okay, that's what I want to do. I'm going to do that now. I was always like, oh, I'm going to go to the NBA before that. But it got this exposure. They were performing at this crazy level. And I was like, okay, that's what I want to do now. So I think it's kind of a multifaceted answer, but I think if we keep bringing success to the table, I think we're going to kind of see things. All right. How has the development of Canadian volleyball changed over the years? So a few notable things. I think back in the day, kind of when I joined the team, everyone would do 5 years at university. It was pretty common that everybody would go do their 5 years at university and then join the national team. And it was a big philosophy at that point, or maybe a little bit after that, we needed to get to international experience sooner. Just because, if you're Italian, when you're 17, you're playing on a pro team. You're not going into your first year university. And U Sports and the CIS at the time provides a great opportunity for young players. But if you're there for 5 years, it may stunt your development a little bit because you're not performing against international competition. So when I left after my second year of university, and then another teammate of mine, Nick Hogue, also left at that time, and it sort of created this influx of players doing that kind of thing, which is very different than it was, the decade before us kind of thing. And then another thing that has to be huge is the fact that we were at the Olympics. I think just the fact that every single person that I talk to that the Olympics come up, it's like, oh yeah, I saw that on TV. Like, oh yeah, I was flipping through and I saw that. And I think the fact that that is now a part of it, it will create a little bit more of a culture in Canada. Like I talked about, all these other countries have crazy leagues and a ton of fans and things like that. When, Canada, we don't really have that. We have that for hockey. We have that for other sports. So it's cool to see, the Olympics kind of be that catalyst that allows it and brings it to Canada a little bit more. Have you or anyone on the team had much success of trial and error with this type of vulnerable sports psych for younger developing athletes? Any tips, ideas to sell for your favorite high school team athletes? Nice. I've never tried it with anybody that young. That being said, it's definitely sports psych, but it's also just understanding your emotions. And I think kids are constantly developing on that road. So I think whether you're, 10 or you're 30, losing will feel a certain way and winning will feel a different way. And I think if you can start to comprehend what those differences are and why they're different, and where they come from and how you can maybe use them to your advantage or just understand them better. Because that was another huge thing for us too, is just the fact that we got to say, hey, I'm nervous. That calmed us down, right? When we're like, no, we're not nervous, but that's not really how we feel. That made us more nervous. And I think that's kind of a universal thing, whether you be, a professional athlete or whether you be younger. I work up north with a lot of younger kids and sort of do like developmental stuff up there. And yeah, it's totally a thing. When you see it more, it's actually interesting because it's a little bit more obvious. I think when you're a kid, you're not as good as hiding when you're nervous or when you're anxious. So it's cool to just point those things out to them and see where it goes. Maybe you don't, if you're with a 10-year-old kid, maybe you're not talking about vulnerability. Maybe you're not talking about whatever, but maybe you are talking about like, hey, how did it feel to, bump that ball that time? Or how did it feel when they got more points than you? Or how did it feel? And constantly they'll be reflecting. It's sort of the same thing that we were doing, just in a different frame. Do you have any advice for someone going into their first Olympics? I think kind of similar to the last one, because it couldn't have gone any better for us in our first game, was just to really try and embrace the experience. And I know that's so much easier said than done. I mean, when you're going to this huge event, everything is so different. It's crazy. But if you're trying to resist anything, that will only get in your way and become difficult. I think if you're able to accept the fact that this is your first Olympics, this might be crazy, then at least maybe you'll be able to use that momentum to your advantage. And also to reach out to other Olympians. When you're in the Canada, like I remember being in the Canada House, and it's the same thing. I don't know what the etiquette is here. Like, am I invading in too many people's space? Am I doing the wrong thing? But it's like, hey, if you reach out to somebody else who's about to do their or just finished their track event or whatever, and you're like, hey, I'm nervous, and they're nervous, that's only going to help you, right? Because then you're going to understand that everybody's going through the same thing. Your competitors are going through the same thing. So yeah, I just advise to, be vulnerable. Okay, notice on Instagram you have a section designated to the books you've read. What are you reading now, or what are your top recommendations? I actually just finished 11 Rings by Phil Jackson, 100% because I was watching Last Dance, and I always wanted to be a basketball player. That I was like, I think I ordered it after I watched the first episode. I was like, okay, I need it. So that was a fantastic book. I just finished it. I'm also reading a book about Laird Hamilton. I don't know if anybody knows. He's a professional surfer, does a bunch of crazy out there stuff, which is now becoming a part of my life, because I'm like, yeah, I got a pretty bad back injury, so I got to take some alternative approaches to try and heal this and try and find a different way. But top recommendations, I think when I was with the full-time center for the national team, we read Mindset as a group by Carol Dweck, and that was like a pretty profound. I mean, it seems simple now when I think about it, but the concept between like having a growth mindset and a fixed mindset was something that I'd never conceptualized before. I always kind of just thought of it as like, oh, you're either evolving or progressing or you're not. But there are actually these different mindsets. So if you're a young athlete, I would say that mindset would be a great one. And then to look at my Instagram, because I can't think of them off the top of my head, but there are a lot. Or message me, say, hey, I want a book on this, because maybe we'll find one and we can read it together, and it'll be great. Sorry, that's great. What are the adjustments that you make in game when your original game plan isn't working? Changing the game tempo, changing strategies, decision making, and that seems quick and rushed. Yeah. So I think another, I mean, I'm constantly reverting it back to our major theme here, which is vulnerability. But I think something when I was a young athlete, I thought, okay, if I can put, just ridiculous amounts of prep into this game, then I will have the perfect game plan and it will go as I want, right? That's like the standard young athlete perspective, right? That I can figure it all out. And I think I was heavily into that. I would scout teams, I would understand them, I knew what I would want to do. And there were so many times with the national team or with pro teams where then you'd go out there and 5 points in, they're a completely different blocking system than I was used to, or they're not responding to my team how I would want. And I would basically just be forcing these things, basically the same way as I'm putting up resistance against feeling nervous. I was putting up resistance against, I have to change. When now, obviously it comes with experience, right? Like I've run more variations of plays, I've done more things, so it's easier. It comes top of mind a little bit quicker. But it will only come to top of mind slower if you're resisting that change, or if you were afraid of what that change would look like. So sometimes it's me. Sometimes when I'm making sets, I'm actually just trying to see what the other team's doing. I may have no idea what's going on. So this next set is literally just for me to watch, right? So maybe in that situation, I'll set my most efficient attacker, because then all of a sudden it still gives me a chance that he might bail me out. And then it will also be able to evolve into me understanding the game plan a little bit better, or evolving the game plan, which is now something that if I'm going to, again, for instance, if I'm going into a game with Cuba, I'm not doing 5 hours of video before the game. I'm doing, okay, Glenn, what did you see? Okay, I do a couple minutes video. Yeah, I get that. And then that's it, because I want to go in and I want to anticipate the fact that it's going to evolve, right? I want to anticipate that when I'm playing against this team who's playing against a different team in this video, that they will respond differently to my style and to my team. But yeah, there's definitely, I think if you can, and I mean, meditation is a great tool for setters. If you want to be able to kind of clear your mind in big moments, it's a pretty cool way to, come back to your fundamentals, go back to basics, things like that, and not get caught up in it. U.S. college talking about eliminating or revising double contact, especially for setters. What do you think about that as a setter? Also, what rule would you like to see changed or revised? So does that mean that they wouldn't call double touches? Whoa. Okay. What do I think about that as a setter? To be honest, though, I think still it doesn't give you much of an advantage, because if you're doing a double contact, A, you're probably going to be less accurate. B, it's going to change your tempo. It's going to change your consistency. So I don't like the idea that they're doing that, because obviously you want a clean game, you want it to look good, you want things like that. But I do think if they took it away, it's not going to do much of an advantage. I think that's kind of a huge thing. And then what rule would I like to see changed or revised? Wow, that's a tough one. I'm trying to think of, well, one big thing right now in the kind of evolution of the game is kind of throw tipping and things like that. Like, so it's a huge part of the game. When actually Stefan Antigua joined us, we're Canadians, we're big, we're strong, so we wanted to go and hit the ball as hard as we can. But then you go and play a much smaller team like France or like something, and they're literally just throwing it to pockets where we aren't. And all of a sudden they're becoming super efficient, and there's less risk of being blocked. There's less risk of all sorts of things. It's a really advantageous play. But it's something that is new to the game. So I think officiating and things like that are unsure of what to call it, because technically the rule is you can't have two different directions, or it can't be in your hand for too long. So if you're still tipping and you're only going forward, technically it is legal. But it's getting to the point where it's maybe a little bit too much. I mean, I like it because I'm a smaller player and it allows me to run a faster offense and we can adjust quicker and things like that. But it's definitely changing the game. So I don't know what I would like to see change in there, but I've noticed a change in it. Sometimes even there's guys on our team that do it, and I'm kind of like, oh, is everybody? Nobody called it. Okay, good. And then we kind of go from there. Have you read Tools of Titan by Tim Ferriss? Is the book I gift the most. I actually haven't. I've definitely read a couple of Tim Ferriss books, and I've followed him quite a while. I haven't read it, but I think it'll be pretty cool. And I think it's right along the lines of what I'm kind of into and things like that. So I appreciate the recommendation. Oh, yes. Can you share who you're staying home for? First thing that comes to mind is my sister, who's a paramedic out in Nova Scotia. So obviously she's